Try to get us started. I'm Alex Barrett. I'm going to be moderating here. We're going to do quick round robin of the Northeast, essentially, get some forest health updates. Mike Parisio is going to come in from Maine on Zoom, so we'll have technological, hopefully that will work. And then we'll have Cam McIntyre talk about beech leaf disease for a little bit, and then we'll get back to emerald ash borer. So the first will be sort of rapid fire, and then we'll have some slightly longer presentations. So first up is Josh Halman, Forest Health Program Manager for Vermont FPR here, based nearby, Essex Junction. He leads the Forest Health Program that includes 5 field staff and 2 field members, operates the Vermont Forest Biology Lab, and Josh assists with all kinds of forest health monitoring and trapping and keeping an eye on things. And thanks for coming here.
Well, thanks, Alex, and thanks everybody for being here today. As was mentioned, I will try and be as rapid as humanly possible here. So we'll just jump right in and talk about the biggest pest story of the year so far in Vermont. And actually, it's a story from last year. Beech leaf disease, which you'll hear plenty about today from Cameron, finally showed up in Vermont last year. We had done a fair bit of outreach about the disease or complex there, and luckily had a landowner contact us from down in Vernon with suspicious leaves. We went down, took a look, and sent them in for confirmation, and indeed we did have beech leaf disease. So we're now on the regional map that I'll show you in just a second. But really shortly after that detection, got another call from TNC actually on their property in Dummerston with a suspect as well. And that site actually looks a little further along with BLD than the Vernon site. So we're keeping our eyes on this. It's obviously something that we're really concerned about, and that has the potential to spread pretty rapidly in the state. If you're unfamiliar with beech leaf disease, I'll give a real quick synopsis of it, is that it's the causal agent is a nematode that interferes with the photosynthesis, cell function within the leaves, and ultimately can result in young trees dying. And in some cases, people, I think in Connecticut, are reporting that they are seeing some mature tree decline and some mortality. So it's definitely something that we want to keep on our radar here. This is the regional map showing all the beech leaf disease counties that have been confirmed within the U.S. The first being out of Ohio in 2012, and you can see that within a decade, that spread is pretty remarkable. And in particular, the 2023 year was a lot of new counties picked up. So we'll be doing plenty of surveys to look for beech leaf disease in the state. We already have 8 spots that are long-term sites within the state where we've been looking for it, and none of those have beech leaf disease as of last year. So we're kind of in a unique situation with those long-term plots that, you know, we expect that we'll start to see some in those plots, but we have quite the baseline that shows no BLD there. So we can actually track you know, the symptoms and the signs and the damage that it's causing in those plots. Want to give a quick plug to Andrew Hirsch, who we recently hired. He's based in Springfield and is responsible for that southeast part of the state. So he'll be doing quite a bit of surveys just on his own looking for beech leaf disease this year, considering where we have detected it. I will let Cam talk much more about beech leaf disease. The other pest that we had that showed up on our doorstep recently was elm zigzag sawfly, and this is kind of at the other end of the state, on the very northern border there with Canada. We had some folks from Canada come down, and this was in 2022, thought that they saw some evidence of elm zigzag sawfly being present in the Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge. We went there and couldn't find any larvae, but were able to go back in 23 and indeed saw quite a bit of feeding, and were able to collect larvae and had those confirmed with APHIS that indeed we do have elm zigzag sawfly, and this is now in 3 counties in Vermont, in Grand Isle, Franklin, and Chittenden counties. What's interesting about this, obviously you can see the pattern of its feeding there. It's hard to mistake this for any other pest. What we did see is that they appear, at least in northwest Vermont, to have a preference for Siberian elm over American elm. This was just anecdotal right now, but we had a couple sites that we were present in where you had full defoliation of Siberian elms, and just the American elms were just beginning to be touched by this. So we're not quite sure exactly how it's going to play out here, but it definitely has a potential to be a important defoliator in the state. And one unique thing about elm zigzag sawfly too is that it has the ability to have multiple generations per year, and quite a high number depending where you are in the range of it or where it exists in the country right now. So anywhere from 4 to 7 generations people are documenting for this pest. So the spread of it could be pretty rapid. This map that you see here is showing all the counties that have had it confirmed from 2021 to up to 2023. The images are from a site that we visited in Milton, Vermont, where we could see the cocoons on some of the trees, but also some feeding of other species. Not that the other species were actually fully defoliated, but once the insect ran out of elm foliage, it moved on to species like ash, oak, and we even saw it on ornamental violets. So they can persist even in the absence of elm for at least a short period of time. So curious to see what that'll look like. The big non-pest story, I think, this year was probably the frost event that we had in mid to late May last year, that caused quite a bit of frost damage across the state. We mainly saw damage to oaks and beech because of the timing of their bud break with this occurring. And we were lucky enough to be able to get a plane up in the air to do a preliminary flight to track some of this damage in the state, and found that a lot of the damage was really localized to river valleys and the slopes going up from those river valleys where the cold air was able to pool. Thank you. So we have just a little bit of data from our aerial surveys, but the Forest Service is actually developing a product that's a remote sensing product that hopefully will be available relatively soon to show the impact of the frost across the region. So look for that coming, hopefully not too long. This is the map that we ultimately generated from our aerial surveys, but this is very underrepresentative of the damage that occurred from that frost event because we're doing the mapping in July and August when things have reflushed. So pretty tricky to do it from the plane, but hopefully the remote sensing product will help us out. Of course, the other big thing we had in the state was a lot of rain this last year, and a lot of rain in the region, to be honest with you. Obviously, that's a picture of Montpelier, fully flooded, and the rain just never really let up after we started getting that heavy rain in July. And so we wound up with a lot of foliar pathogens from anthracnose to septoria in the state, and it did have a little bit of an impact on our fall color this last year. So hopefully we do not have that same high level of rainfall this year. A quick update on HWA in the state. Hemlock woolly adelgid, as you may know, is largely in the southeast corner of the state, but we've been trying to better delineate where HWA is because we appear to be having these warmer winters and are concerned about the spread. And this slide is showing new detections as of 2024, those gray circles. And even this slide is out of date. We've got at least one more town now, Baltimore, Vermont, that little sliver there next to Wethersfield is now positive for HWA as well. So it's great that we're able to get out there and look for this and see what the expansion is. And really the context for that is that HWA in our state is limited by cold, and that's what's really kept it from spreading quite a bit. What we're seeing here, this graph is looking at winter mortality figures for HWA. So every year we bring in branches and see how many of those have actually died. And normally you want a threshold of about 90% to show that you're not going to have heavy spread of HWA in the area. You can see that in recent years we've been below that threshold, and I just got data back from our lab this week showing that indeed our mortality numbers for HWA are pretty low this year at 37%. So with that lack of control from very cold winters, we are concerned about the spread of HWA in the state and continue to look for that. EAB in the state, real briefly I'll talk about this because I know Bill's going to give us an update on EAB in general. But we picked up 20 new towns in 2023. We still have no EAB in Essex County. And we continue to have our biocontrol program. We'll have 3 sites that are active this year for releasing parasitoid wasps. And we'll be beginning recoveries from some previously retired biocontrol sites to confirm that we have established those biocontrol populations in the state. I think the last data thing I have to present really is an update on spruce budworm. If you were at any of our talks in the last couple of years, you know that we were a little concerned in the state about really high moth catch in 2022, the highest that we've seen on record here. We have 7 sites in the state where we trap for spruce budworm, and we were concerned that we might have an outbreak looming. Luckily, we were able to do some what's called L2 sampling, or sampling for larvae, and send that to the mech lab at UMaine. And that data showed that we did not have a building population within the trees themselves, and that those moths may have blown in from a weather event, which resulted in that big peak that you see there on the right side of the graph. And indeed, that was confirmed last year when we had our trap catch come in. It was very low once again. So it looks like that 22 blip was indeed weather mediated, and we do not right now have enough of a population that we're expecting an outbreak of spruce budworm. Real quick with program news, I just want to let you know that if you're familiar with our forest health program in the past here in Vermont, it used to be combined fire, wildland fire, and forest health. This year we've actually been able to separate those 2 programs. So now our staff in forest health are dedicated to forest health tasks, and the fire program has staff dedicated solely to fire. And so we're fortunate enough to have 5 district forest health foresters. We also have our lab in Randolph, where we have 2 people, and then we will be hiring, or we have hired, but they have not started yet, a new invasive species specialist based in Montpelier to help kind of coordinate some of our efforts with emerald ash borer and invasive plants across the state. And finally, just want to show this. I don't think this is on our website quite yet, but it should be there in the next few days. This is a new dashboard that we've developed that will show you which invasive pests are in a particular town that you're interested in. You'll be able to click on this map, and a little box will show up showing you each pest that has been confirmed or not confirmed within that town, as well as the year that it was confirmed. And then some of our major pests run across the top banner there, and you can click on those to see which towns have the insect that you're concerned about. So that's my mad dash, and I probably still went over. Any time for questions, or should we move?
I think if we get through 3, then we can do questions at the end.
Got it. Great.
Good job.
Thank you.
All right, Bill is next. We'll go online, next one, the third one.
Gotcha.
So Bill is a forest health specialist with New Hampshire Division of Forest and Lands Forest Health Program. He carries out detection, management, outreach programs. He has a master's degree in forest entomology from University of Kentucky, where he worked toward developing integrated pest management programs for emerald ash borer. And he's, in a total benefit to us in the Northeast, brought that here and helping do that here. So he's going to give an update from New Hampshire, and then we'll get him back on stage for a more detailed look at emerald ash borer too.
All right, thank you. One more. All right, yeah, so I'm going to give a brief overview of the forest health situation in New Hampshire. We're next to Vermont, very similar to Vermont, seeing a lot of the same forest health issues, so I'm going to just kind of mention some of this stuff and not go over in detail again, so you don't have to listen to the same stuff twice. All right, how do I, oh, here we go. Oh, okay, thank you. All right, thank you. All right, so first of all, I'll just go over our the results of our aerial survey flights. And so just as a background, every year we fly transects over the entire state and map any damage that we see to the forests. 2023 was by far the most damage we mapped in any given year since I've been here, so in the last 10 years or so. And the biggest damage causing agent that we saw was frost, followed by emerald ash borer, and then spongy moth. I think in total we mapped about 400,000 acres of damage, which is about 10% of the land area in the state. All right, so emerald ash borer, I'm going to talk about emerald ash borer more in my talk at the end of this session, so I'm not going to go in a ton of detail here, but here's our management map, our detection map. It was first discovered in New Hampshire in 2013 in the Concord area, so that's kind of that center orange-red area that you see. And we just found it in Coos County, our most northern county, last winter. So now it's in all 10 counties in the state. And we put a lot of effort into tracking the spread of EAB as it moved through the state. And so we were able to kind of create this nice map, and you can see that kind of radial progression from Concord outwards. And so right now, the damage is heaviest in that Concord area. The farther away you get from Concord, for the most part, the less severe the damage is. And that's kind of the situation there. Moving on, hemlock woolly adelgid. Similarly, we track it. It's been in New Hampshire for 20 years. These are the towns that it's in. It's kind of moving northward as our winters get warmer, and it's able to survive farther north and farther inland. We had no new detections in 2023. That was partly due to a really cold, last winter was relatively warm, but we did have one really cold snap, which was enough to knock back the population of adelgid significantly. This is kind of similar to that graph that Josh showed. The blue line is the extreme cold temperature in Concord for a given year. The orange line is what proportion of the adelgids survived the winter, and so you can see a pretty strong correlation between how cold the coldest day was and how many adelgids survived. So last year we had a lot of adelgid kill. The 2024, like the 23-24 winter, so this current winter, isn't yet on this graph, but we do have preliminary numbers in, and it was by far the warmest winter. I think the coldest day in Concord was like coldest night was 4 degrees Fahrenheit, which wouldn't even show up. We'd have to make a new axis for the chart. And we're seeing like 25% mortality, something like that. So it's expected that we're going to see high adelgid populations next year. And then we've been working a lot in the last few years on implementing biological controls for the adelgid. And so for several years, we've been releasing the beetle Laricobius nigrinus. That's the one that you see in the top left there. It's native to the Pacific Northwest, and we've received beetles from there. There's also a few labs in like Virginia, and we've collected some from Maryland and released them in New Hampshire with the goal of establishing populations to hopefully one day help control adelgid populations. There's also another biocontrol called Leucotraxis is the genus. It's a silver fly, so you can see the adult fly in the bottom left there next to the larva feeding on some adelgid eggs. And that's a kind of newer one that we're trying to implement, and we released that for the first time in New Hampshire this year. We have a kind of an area in Durham that we've managed specifically as an insectary. So it's kind of like hemlock. There was hemlock in the overstory that were released to kind of promote this low, bushy, growing form where we can release the biocontrols and then easily collect them from that area. And so that's been established, and we're able to consistently collect the Laricobius from this area, and hopefully we made a release of over 800 silverflies there that we hope gets established as well. Elongate hemlock scale, so this is another invasive pest of hemlocks, and so typically in New Hampshire we primarily see like heavy hemlock decline in areas that have heavy infestations of both adelgid and scale. The scale infestation isn't as extensive, but it's also moving farther north. And we had 13 new towns detected in 2023, mostly just filling in kind of existing or local movement or filling in gaps in the map. And let's see, for 2 years, in 2021 and 2022, we had extensive hemlock looper outbreaks in the southern part of the state. That now appears to be over, but we're seeing lots of dead and dying and stressed hemlock trees that are getting hit by native insects like hemlock borer that kind of thrive in these areas where you have lots of dead and dying trees. And we're seeing, there was some understory hemlock that survived, but not a lot, and most of the stuff coming back in tends to be species like red maple and black birch. Red pine scale is another invasive that we're tracking. It's on the rise. We're mapping more and more of it and picking up new detections every year. And typically we're seeing it in, that picture on the left is kind of like a CCC plantations, so like these 70, 80-year-old plantations of like monoculture red pine, that's typically where we see it. But then you can also see in the picture on the right in the lakes region of New Hampshire, I hope you can see like in that kind of little strip of land between those two lakes, there's some dead trees in there. And those are red pine scales killing kind of naturally growing red pine. Again, beech leaf disease, we found it last year in New Hampshire. I'm not going to go into this because Cam's going to talk about it extensively. But we found it in 6 towns last year and 14 new towns in 2023. And you can see by the kind of disjoint nature of these towns that we found it in, it seems to be kind of prevalent and extensive throughout the southern part of the state. It's probably in a lot of these towns that haven't and just hasn't been found yet, and we expect to pick up a lot of new detections in the coming year. Again, we had extensive frost damage, like all of the Northeast. Here's some pictures of some, these are some, the picture on the right is some ash. You can see the terminal leaves got hit by the frost, but the more basal leaves that had leafed out previously, you know, for like over a week before the frost event had enough time to kind of fully develop and harden themselves against the cold. We really saw most of the damage similar to other states on oaks and beeches. So this is kind of a typical scene from the area. Here's a time lapse of a single seedling tree progressing throughout the year. So you can kind of see as you go from left to right, the tree lost all its early leaves and then begins to refoliate. So for most healthy trees, by the end of the year, they had fully recovered and you wouldn't have been able to tell that they had been damaged. Here's some, this is kind of what it looked like in the summer when we were flying those aerial surveys. Just by the time we had flown, most of the trees had refoliated and they just kind of looked a little discolored. And that's kind of what it looks like from the ground. Some of the trees had this kind of orange-red hue that we could pick up. And then beeches were a little slower to recover. The damage to beech wasn't as extensive for whatever reason, we're not really sure, but when the areas that did get hit had pretty severe damage. This is what it looked like in a heavily damaged stand in August. So yeah, you can see there's pretty extensive damage to some of those leaves. And kind of the biggest story from the last few years was spongy moth. So New Hampshire experienced large-scale spongy moth outbreaks for the first time in over 30 years. The outbreak started in 2021 and continued. It's continued into this year. And we've mapped about 50,000 acres of damage each year. In some areas that have been experiencing it the longest, we're starting to see severe dieback and decline. So that picture on the left isn't defoliated trees, those are actually dead and declining trees. And so you can see what those trees look like on the ground in that picture on the right. And so I guess the last thing I'll cover is some of our trapping surveys. So we also trap for spruce budworm. We've had consistently low catches, less than 20 moths captured per trap, which is well below the threshold that would be necessary to indicate any future outbreaks. And so currently we're not really worried about any spruce budworm outbreaks in New Hampshire. We also detected southern pine beetle for the first time in traps 2 years ago. And so we continue to trap for it. We didn't catch anything in any of our traps this year, and to date we haven't found any southern pine beetles in any trees. We've only had a single year where we caught it in traps. And so it's something we're continuing to monitor, but aren't immediately concerned that it's going to start causing problems in our pitch pine stands. Brown-tail moth, this is a major problem in Maine. It started kind of along coastal Maine and has been moving inland to the point now where it's within just a few miles of the New Hampshire border. So these green traps along the eastern border of New Hampshire are brown-tail moth traps. We luckily didn't catch any in 2023, but we're going to redeploy the traps next year and stay on the lookout for this insect. And then we also trapped for nitadulids, which can vector oak wilt disease. And we did find some of these nitadulids that came back positive for oak wilt DNA, which that doesn't necessarily mean we have any positive finds for oak wilt. It's just shows that the beetles are coming in from somewhere that have the fungal DNA on them, and so we're going to do surveys this next year looking for infected trees. And it's low on time, so I'm not going to go into this. We did find infested trees with Cyrex noctilia, which is an invasive wood wasp. It's been in other states. I think it's been in New York and Vermont for several years, but we just found infested trees for the first time in New Hampshire this year. We don't expect it to be a major problem, but again, something we're aware of and we'll keep an eye on. We also, similar to Vermont, had heavy rains and saw lots of water stress, lots of spread of foliar diseases like anthracnose, causing early brown up of leaves and early leaf drop. This is something we expect to go away in future years relatively quickly if we return to kind of normal rainfall. We also saw lots of leaf miner damage in the northern part of the state on aspens. Native pest, we expect it to not be a major issue. And across the region, Scotch pine looked kind of crappy all over the place, and so it's something we've known about for a long time, and so we went to investigate it and found it's probably things like brown spot needle blight and diplodia, and that's all. Sorry.
So here's Mike. I don't.
Yeah, we'll get him up there.
All right. Hey, Mike.
Hey, good morning, everyone.
Our third update is going to come from Maine via the magic of technology. Mike Parisio has served as forest entomologist for the Maine Forest Service in Augusta since 2019. Prior to that, he worked as forest health specialist here in Vermont, and before that in Minnesota.
Can we get a sound check from Mike?
Can you hear me out there?
Okay, one sec. Yep. You hear him? Is this quiet?
Hello, hello, hello.
All right, Mike, try again.
Can you hear me now?
All right, we'll turn that up. Yep.
Am I good to go? All right, I'm assuming so, and you're sharing my screen, so I'll need somebody to advance slides for me. So anyways, good morning, folks. Mike Parisio here at the state of Maine. I'm going to rip through some of the hot topics going on in Maine right now. So yeah, like Bill said, a lot of us northern New England states, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine have a lot of similar problems, but I'll touch on some unique Maine problems just so they're on your radars and horizons in case they ever make their way a little bit farther west. So go ahead and give me my next slide, please. Okay, so I'll start with brown-tail moths. So yeah, this is a insect that's been outbreaking in Maine for quite a while now. Those familiar with Maine geography, the interesting things that have happened with this recently, the outbreak was really raging in the mid-coast region here. So what we're seeing now is that some of these pockets have collapsed for whatever reason. We do get some prevalence of disease on the landscape. It's kind of similar to spongy moth in that there's some natural controls out there that can cause local population crashes, but you see it really migrating towards the northeast here. So these are some of the worst damage spots as far as documented by aerial survey in 2023. So yeah, you can really see that brown-tail moth has left the mid-coast and really migrated into the Penobscot River corridor. So just looking at the numbers, typically we're documenting, 150 to 200,000 acres of damage a year. We had much less in 2023, as the other forest health guys mentioned. A lot of that's due to some problems with aerial survey. But yeah, this is an interesting insect with its life cycle. So they overwinter as a second instar, early instar caterpillars and winter webs. And so they're early season defoliators. So we capture that defoliation. But then they also have a second generation later in the year. So these young caterpillars come out and they skeletonize leaves later in the fall to get ready for winter. And yeah, while that shows up plenty fine in aerial survey for keeping track of locations, not a terrible amount of damage. But okay, next slide. So I mentioned that brown-tailed moth overwinters in these winter webs as early instar caterpillars. You can see a close-up in that circle image there. And then you can see, a classic example of a heavily infested oak tree in Maine in that larger picture there. So on bright sunny days in winter, these show up quite nice. The silk is bright white and reflected by the sun. So this is how we do a lot of our survey. And as Bill mentioned, browntail, even though a lot of the damage is in the Penobscot River corridor, as far as presence absence, it is making its way to the New Hampshire border. So something we're in touch with our neighbors about and keeping an eye on. But yeah, basically we drive with a driver and a surveyor, and you can see these out the truck window, and we just punch points on the map. So we get good coverage throughout the state. So okay, next slide. Again, yeah, as Bill mentioned, yeah, we had some severe problems with spongy moth in Maine as well, and this is right across from Conway, New Hampshire, where a lot of that spongy moth damage was. So again, multiple years of 50,000 plus acres of defoliation stuff paired with drought, and then while some of the weather conditions improved recently, again, we had that super late frost that annihilated a lot of these oak trees. So you can see in that map section, a lot of these areas have been heavily defoliated from spongy moth or frost for 3 years paired with droughts. So, those dark red polygons documented in 2023, a lot of that is actual mortality now, and I expect we'll find a lot more. So from a forestry perspective, this is one of the most significant things going on where we're actually going to have some significant mortality. So, okay, next slide. Winter moth, again, this is mostly a Maine problem. I just bring it up so it's on people's radars. They're actually seeing some activity in Rhode Island as well, but mostly a coastal problem. An oak defoliator. They also like Norway maple quite a bit. But yeah, if this ever does make it into some other areas, fortunately, this is one of the forest pests with a really, successful and promising biocontrol program. So yeah, University of Massachusetts Amherst is really refine this program, and we work with them closely to, capture infected caterpillars, rear them, and release them every year. So we've got some really good release coverage and some parasitism rate at our study sites. So, okay, next slide. So emerald ash borer in Maine. So again, we still have two major regions with emerald ash borer infestation. They started at the same time in 2018. But you can see, just how dramatic the spread has been in southern Maine compared to northern Maine. So northern Maine still really progressing slowly, fortunately. But yeah, we're really still we're right at that floodgate stage in southern Maine. So we are a state that still actually has active quarantine laws about emerald ash borer and firewood and stuff like that. So you can see that blue boundary is our current extent, and yeah, the ash belt of Maine runs, pretty much due northeast there, and you can see that basal area maybe in the green on the back. So most of the ash resource is now in regulated areas, but we're trying to keep it out of that, basal area that's prevalent further north. So, okay, next slide. Forest tent caterpillars. So yeah, I bring this up because I know some of our other northeastern states have had, past problems just like us, and sometimes these defoliators outbreak regionally. I haven't heard any information from New Hampshire, Vermont as far as recent, but yeah, we doubled in defoliation this year from about a little under 20,000 to mid 30s this year, but mostly on aspen up north. Really good recovery, so not something we're super concerned about, but it is happening. So next slide, please. Spruce budworm. So yeah, both Josh and Bill have already touched on this. So yeah, we do a lot of spruce budworm monitoring in Maine compared to New Hampshire and Vermont, just based on that suitable habitat type. So yeah, northern Maine, we do a lot of extensive monitoring, and fortunately these guys have shared their data with us so we can kind of keep an eye on the regional picture across our 3 states. And then, yeah, so mostly quiet. But if you go to the next slide, I'll explain some of those bigger points up north. So yeah, we did have some, and these are all recoveries in pheromone traps. So these are all pheromone trap sites. So we had some higher recoveries in these areas. And as Josh mentioned, like what happened to Vermont last year and what happened to Maine in 2019, budworm dispersal is really, driven by a big outbreak in Canada and, prevailing wind and climate and atmospheric conditions. So imagine a plume of smoke basically, and that's where these guys can wind up. So sometimes these migrations are big enough to capture on radar and, with modeling, what I think happened here, since this wasn't captured there, we have some active defoliation in Quebec right across the board, and we had some low level blow-ins into these sites, but we're going to keep an eye on them. So next slide. Hemlock woolly delgid, same story as some of the other states. It's readily advancing. An interesting story in Maine. It's mostly been a coastal problem historically, presumably due to the moderated climate there. But as we kind of lose some of our cold winters, we are seeing inland migration from the coastal areas. So we did just expand our quarantine area quite a bit in response to some finds just outside of our previous quarantine area. So that's hatched in green there. So now we have quite a large regulated area. Next slide. So yeah, just to point out, we have a very active biocontrol program here in Maine too, just like the other states. So we're cranking along at that. So we're fortunate to have access to those resources, and we'll continue to employ that wherever we can. Next slide, please. Beech leaf disease. Again, this is one that came onto the Maine scene just a couple of years ago and has really exploded. So yeah, we're now in 11 of 16 counties, and yeah, you can see, just like other states, it starts at an epicenter and it just radiates out. So go ahead to the next slide. So one thing we're doing, instead of just survey during the summer months or with leaf on to look for banding and stuff like that, we've taken a note from other people's books, and we're doing this winter bud survey because you can actually see the damage from the nematodes at this stage. So we have actually had a couple new detections just this winter, our first year of doing this. So yeah, we kind of recommend this to other states that are thinking about it, or other groups. It's a good tool, although it's tedious. Next slide. European large canker, again, I just bring this up. This is another one of those things that's mostly a Maine problem, but it is a regulated pest here. I just want to point out that, yeah, similarly, as our survey capacities and, methods get better and better, we have ability to find this stuff in new places. So this is another one where previously had a very small regulated area, but we did just go through another round of expansions there. So you can see that blue hatch zone is now the area that's regulated for European large canker in Maine. Next slide. Oh, good, there is none. So hopefully I caught you up on time a little bit. I probably won't expect questions, but there's my contact information. Anybody that wants to talk more about anything I skirted over, send me a note, and happy to chat. So thank you for having me.
All right, so I've done a